Google isn't maybe as smart as what we want it to be, that Google isn't maybe a benevolent overlord of the web that is omnipotent and does knows and sees everything, but that it is just another company that's struggling to build a product that its users want to use.
Hi, I'm Eric Schwartzman, author of The Digital Pivot, and this is the Earned Media Podcast. Our guest today is Barry Adams of Polemic Digital. He's an SEO consultant. Barry, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric.
So you started, I know, as a webmaster, and then how did you kind of wind up gravitating to news SEO, which I know you're a specialist in?
Yeah, as a webmaster back in the early 2000s, you sort of take on every single bit of responsibility for growing traffic and audience to a website. And I gravitated towards SEO quite naturally because I think it's like the perfect combination of technology and marketing really for me. And then when I moved to Northern Ireland, my first job here was at the Belfast Telegraph as their in-house SEO specialist. And that really opened my eyes to the wonderful world of SEO for news websites, which is quite a different kettle of fish than classic SEO, as I would call it. And then when I went freelance in 2014, I was lucky to get some projects with big news publishers under my belt fairly quickly. That sort of opened a lot of doors for me and allowed me to develop that specialty. And that's how I got to where I am today.
What is news SEO?
Yeah, it's focused on getting a news article ranking in Google's news-specific ecosystem. And that encompasses things like Google News itself, the news vertical, and the news tab on Google search results, although both of those are actually fairly small traffic sources. The main focus is on getting into top stories boxes, top stories carousels on regular search results, as well as the Discover feed on Android devices and in the Google app on iPhones. Those two together tend to be the biggest sources of traffic for most news publishers. So SEO efforts for news websites tend to focus on both short-term tactics for article optimization and long-term tactics for topic authority, focusing on performance in those specific areas of Google.
So Google Top Stories in regular search results appears at the top with a bunch of stories there. That's, I guess, a different algorithm, right?
It's based more or less on the same algorithm, but it's much faster moving because news has to show up fairly quickly. You know, when an article is published, Google wants to start showing that in top stories as soon as it can because people want the latest news and updates, which means a lot of the processes that Google would perform as part of regular indexing and ranking of content don't necessarily apply to news. Google has to take a few shortcuts along the way. For example, there's very little deduplication that goes on. Google doesn't really have time to render web pages and execute clients like JavaScript, so you have to have a better optimized HTML. And Google relies quite heavily on the structured data you have implemented on article pages to very quickly understand what the featured image is, what the headline is, all those sorts of things. And Google relies on the signals that the publisher itself has built up historically to see whether or not a newly published article can rank, is allowed to rank for certain keywords and topics, because of course the article itself will not have built up any link value yet, will not have built up any authority signals of its own. So Google relies on what the website has achieved so far to sort of immediately assign that to a new article and allow that article to rank based on the historic metrics that the publication has.
So if you're dealing with a product that's got a very short shelf life, this is like, I guess, the milk of web pages. How do you get it indexed and to market quickly?
Yeah, fortunately, Google helps us a lot with this. It tends to spend quite a lot of crawl effort on news websites. Usually when you publish an article and you show it on your news publication's homepage, within a couple of minutes, it'll be indexed. Google tends to crawl news homepages and main section pages at least once a minute or even more for big publications, just trying to find new articles. And the moment it sees a new URL linked from your homepage or your key navigation section pages, it'll index that pretty much straight away. And like I said, it doesn't really do a lot of deduplication there. So if Google sees a new URL, even if it's basically an article. It's already indexed with the same headline. Google will still index it and treat it as a new article, because the only deduplication Google can really do is based on the unique identifier being the article's URL. So getting content indexed is generally not that big of a challenge, unless you have major technical issues with your website, which is one of the areas that I collaborate with for a lot of my clients to make sure that their technical setup is correct to enable very fast crawling and indexing of newly published content.
So obviously, if you're a big name media outlet, it's easy enough for Google to manually make sure that they're crawling you frequently. But we are living in an environment now where news breaks come from the strangest places. Sometimes they come from consumers on social media. And at the same time, we know that news organizations are posting their stories or links to their stories on social media. So what moves faster? Do you ever wind up seeing social media or consumer generated content showing up in top stories, or is it always strictly news?
It's very rare to see a social media post show up in top stories. It's usually articles about the social media post that tend to arrive in top stories. Top stories is very prominent real estate on a Google search result. It tends to show up, especially for big stories, at the top of a search result, although you often see top stories boxes lower down in the search results as well, if it's not maybe a hot topic or the news is a little bit old. But generally, for popular topics and news topics, the top stories box is right at the top. So Google wants to make sure that you have to earn your way in there. It tends to be quite careful about the websites it allows to rank in there and the kind of stories are allowed to rank in there. You need to build up certain authority metrics and trust signals before Google will allow your content to show up in those top stories boxes. And generally, social media platforms aren't allowed in there because there's very little curation of content that goes on there. So Google tends to rely more on the big publications or specialized publications that have earned their stripes to report those stories that may first break on social media and then show articles about those social media posts in those top stories boxes.
So all things being equal, let's say, you've got sites that all have those trust signals in place. Is it safe to say that if you break the story first, you're going to wind up in top stories? Or could you break the story and then your competitors cover your break of the story and they wind up in top stories and you're out in the cold? Does that happen?
It happens too frequently, yes. Unfortunately, top stories, by virtue of the speed with which Google has to make sure content is shown there, it tends to have a very strong preference for newer articles, which means by the time, if you're the first news outlet to break a story, there might not be enough signals for Google to understand that it's a news story. So you might not even get a top stories box because that might just be your article, one article on that topic. The more publishers start to write about that story, the more signals Google gets that, hey, this is probably a news topic. I might need to insert a top stories box of some description in a search result about this topic. And at that point, Google decides who gets into that top stories box. And like I said, Google has a very strong preference for newer content. And if you're the first publisher on a topic, your article might be old. It might be a few hours old. And there might be a lot of other publications that have newer articles available for Google to show there. Now, Google does strive to reward original publishers who break a story. They have something called the highly cited label, and that would show up in top stories as the highly cited source, which means if a lot of other news publications pick up your original story and quote you and maybe link to you, Google tries to recognize that and show you in top stories as the highly cited source. But that is a bit hit and miss. That's not guaranteed in any way, shape, or form. And what you see happen quite often is that one publication breaks a story, and then by the time Google will generate the top stories box in their search results for the topic of that story, their article is too old, and newer articles from other publications writing about the exact same thing will take up that space in top stories. And that is just one of the weaknesses that Google's news ecosystem has, because Google has to show the newest content in those top stories boxes.
So from a consumer standpoint, if you're a news hound interested in breaking news, Google's really not the best place to go.
Generally not. No, Google tends to be at least about an hour, I'd say, behind the fact. I think social media probably is still your best bet. However, I would say if you want the most detailed analysis and the most informative content, Google is probably a safer bet than social media, because at least Google tries to reward websites that have built up proper journalistic experience and do fact checking and make sure that they report proper news. Whereas, as you know, you can't trust anything you see on social media.
But, we know that Google had spent a lot of time and energy working directly with the news media. They have people on staff whose job is just to work with news media. News media is a very important category for them. And we have seen the same thing with social media. So we don't, I guess, know, do we, whether or not the social media algorithms prioritize news publishers?
Less and less so, actually. Talking to my publishing clients, they see a lot less traffic from social media outlets than they used to. Twitter has always been a tiny fraction of traffic to most publishers. Facebook used to be pretty decent, but that's less and less and less every year. And this traffic is just declining because Facebook prioritizes just personal interaction. There are some social platforms that have a high degree of news content, like TikTok, for example, but that does not send traffic to publishers. That's just keeping people on the platform. Plus, if I'm entirely honest, I don't think the TikTok algorithms can be trusted to provide people with actual factual news. A lot of it is active disinformation and just blatant lies being spread around. So I wouldn't trust it as a news source, as a news consumer, let alone as a publisher trying to build a bit of a brand on there, because you'd be in fairly bad company, if I'm entirely honest. I think publishers just need to try and get audiences become loyal to themselves directly. And I'm saying this as an SEO guy. I don't think you should rely on SEO or social or email or any other channel to drive traffic to your website, because there's always an intermediary there. And the best way to build an audience and to grow your revenue as a publisher is to make people come directly to you and bypass all the middlemen.
So, speaking generally about kind of everything you see with respect to traffic to news sites from Google, you mentioned that the least amount of traffic goes from the news tab and from news search. Can you tell us kind of how much traffic comes from top stories? And then talk to us a little bit more about this Discover product, which, as you said, if you have an Android phone and you have the Google app on your phone, when you bring up the search screen, below that search box will be some stories, and that's Google Discover. And what tends to send more traffic to publishers? Is it Discover or top stories?
It varies by publisher. I mean, we talk about Google News, like the news.google.com vertical. That's maybe 3, 4, 5% of your total traffic. The News tab, like if you have a Google search result, there will be a News tab where you see news articles about that particular search. That's like 3 or 4% of your traffic total as well. And then it really varies by publisher how much Discover versus top stories traffic they get, but combined, they probably account for 90% of your total Google traffic, your total organic traffic, I can even say. And that's, of course, not counting social media, referral traffic, all those other sources. If you take that wider picture, total Google traffic to most of my publishers varies between 40 and 70%. I think 50% traffic from Google is more or less the benchmark in the industry. And that sort of worries me, because it does mean you're quite dependent on Google traffic. But, it's just the ecosystem we live in. A lot of people go to Google to get the news. So we have to sort of play that game. Whether the top stories or Discover is the biggest driver of traffic, so that depends on your market, on your topics that you cover. Discover is very much based on what Google knows about you in terms of your interests and topics that you search for regularly, and it tries to show you articles based on those metrics it has, the information Google knows about you, to make sure that it's content you would, as a user, enjoy reading or have a high probability of enjoying. And Google likes to show you content from websites that they know you engage with regularly. If you tap on the same publisher regularly, then you will get more content from that same publisher in your Discover feed. So it really depends on what kind of content you write as a publisher, and if it aligns with people's interests and people's topics that they search for and that they're interested in. And if you do that, you tend to get a high degree of discover traffic. Celebrity news, lifestyle news, sport news, they tend to be categories of news that would do really well in discover. Whereas if you're more like a hard news publisher with like proper news headlines, world affairs, politics, that sort of stuff, you tend to be more reliant on top stories for traffic because that's less likely to align with the discover feed, but more likely to align with what people would search for. And they want the daily headlines of what's happening in the world or what's happening in finance or what's happening in politics at any given time. So for those sorts of publishers, I would expect top stories in Google search to be the highest driver of traffic.
We're talking to Barry Adams. He is an SEO consultant with Polemic Digital. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the Google search algorithm leak. Stay with us. Barry, what is the Google leak?
Yeah, apparently somebody at Google inadvertently published their content warehouse API live on a public GitHub repository. Now, indeed, I think it's important for us to understand that we're not talking about Google's algorithm. We're talking about an API that provides data and metrics to whoever can make calls to the API. And I suspect that's something that Google uses for internal purposes, for maybe its search engine, maybe for internal testing purposes, maybe for all kinds of other platforms, because we see stuff in there related to YouTube as well, for example, and to other aspects of Google. So I think it is just a collection of metrics and attributes about the web and Google's index of the web that can be used internally by Google in all kinds of different ways. Now, we have found some really interesting metrics in there that sort of confirmed what we already suspected Google was doing in terms of gathering data and whether or not they use it. For example, data about how users click and engage with websites and how that might filter into certain specific parts of Google's actual algorithm. But also some things that contradict what Google has said. For example, having site-wide authority signals, or the fact that they use Chrome click data, which Google has denied repeatedly, and now we know for a fact they actually do, at least the very least, gather the data. Whether or not they use it, of course, we really can't tell, but we know that they at least gather that data.
Let's talk for a moment about site-wide authority signals. What did the leak have to say about that?
Yeah, there's a few things there. I mean, of course, there was only one metric that directly related to that, called site authority, but that's probably too vague of a metric in and of itself. But things like, for example, homepage PageRank. Google measures the PageRank of a website's homepage, and I think that makes sense, especially in the context of news. For example, if you publish an article, you show that on the news website's homepage, it needs to have some link value, but it hasn't built up its own link profile yet, because it's a fresh article. So Google needs to assign it a certain link score, and a derivative of the homepage PageRank makes sense in that regard to give that article a good chance to rank straight away. Also things like spam scores, which were probably applied site-wide as well. Those are part of the API leak as well. So we can see that Google does gather metrics on a domain-wide and site-wide level that may or may not apply to various different parts of their algorithm.
But you say may or may not. How conclusive is this leak data?
Oh, it's totally inconclusive. It is just purely APIs. And like I said, it doesn't reveal us anything really about the algorithm itself or the weightings of these metrics or how they're used or if they're used at all. All that we do know is the kinds of metrics Google gathers and collects and measures with regards to websites and web pages. How these are actually used, really don't know. But then we didn't know before either, and we still managed to make some really good informed guesses about how Google works and what they do and don't collect as far as the data goes. And this leak more or less confirms a lot of that. And it doesn't really contradict anything that we've done in SEO. In fact, it probably confirms more of the stuff that Google has maybe denied or has been very sketchy about that they don't want us to know. And the leak pretty much tells us that as an SEO industry, we've been more or less on the right track. We sort of already knew what worked and what didn't work. And now we actually have the names of the metrics that Google uses to determine whether or not those signals go into their algorithm.
Of all the stuff you've looked at with the leak, what are sort of the biggest takeaways for you?
I think the interesting parts there are things related to links and the value of specific links, as well as the anchor texts that Google takes into account for a link. For example, this one, sort of something we already suspected, but we find really interesting data in the leak that determines the value of a link relates to where the page that the link exists on is stored in Google's index. As you may know, Google has tiered level of storage in its index. To different levels of hardware for different parts of its index. Like the fastest hardware that Google stores parts of its index on is RAM storage. Then there's a second tier of solid-state hard drive storage, and a third level of old-fashioned hard disk storage. Hard disk being relatively slow to retrieve and store pages on. Solid state being a lot faster, and RAM storage being the fastest way to store web pages. And web pages that are stored in RAM are the kind of web pages that Google would expect to serve in their search results quite often. Pages that are ranked very highly in search results, that are part of very popular searches, and also news stories and news articles that have to be populated in those top storage boxes very quickly. They tend to be stored in that RAM storage level of Google's indexing system. It turns out that the value of a link relates directly to where those pages are stored. So if you have a link from a web page that is stored in RAM storage, the fastest storage, that sends the most link value to that target destination, the target URL. Whereas if your link is stored on a web page in solid state or on a hard drive, that sends a lot less link value to the target destination. Which, if you're a link builder, might be quite interesting, which means you might have to shift your tactics away from doing things like niche site edits where you get a link into older content, because it turns out that those older pages are very likely to be stored on hard drives, or if you're lucky, in solid state, and therefore the links from those pages don't carry a lot of weight. And you should maybe focus your effort more on digital PR and getting mentions in news articles, because those articles will be stored on RAM storage, and therefore the links from those articles have a lot more value to the target URL you're sending the link to. So, that was one of the things I found probably most interesting. Also, from a news publisher perspective, that you really have to be careful about the power you have in terms of linking out to sources and out to other websites. And from an SEO link building perspective, that you really need to go after high value links from high value publications.
Fascinating. When you say digital PR, that exists on many levels too. You can hire someone who's going to put out a press release and get you backlinks that way. And you can hire a public relations person who's actually going to, try to get original stories written through news media contacts. Do you think there's an advantage of one over the other? They're both going to be on RAM. So are they both just as good?
I think you just need to fire on all cylinders there and not go all in on one particular tactic. I think you need creative link building campaigns with creative content marketing that might generate news stories for certain types of websites that like to cover that sort of stuff. And you also need to do what I would call serious PR and trying to get press mentions, trying to get spokespeople for your company as part of certain news stories, maybe even try to do collaborative content with specialized publishers, something that, for example, in the B2B space would be quite an interesting tactic. As long as you get mentions and get links from highly authoritative news publishers, those tactics tend to be the best ones out there.
Well, one of the other things we found in the leak, in the Google leak, was that click activity in the Chrome browser also is a signal. And so I wonder, what are some ways that news media sites can either increase or harm their engagement rates?
Yeah, engagement we've already known to be quite an important signal, especially in the Discover feed. And now we just know what kind of metrics Google assigns to those metrics. So I can't say we're entirely surprised by that. It does sort of put a word of caution to websites that have a paywall. I think people recognize a brand that has a paywall, and when they see that brand show up in the top stories carousel, they'll probably less likely to click on it. I'm a fan of premium paywall models where maybe you get a few clicks for free before the paywall kicks in, because it means at least people feel they can read the article that shows up in their top stories or in their Discover feed and then engage with that, which means you get a positive engagement signal and Google will record that as a positive click to your website. So I think as a publisher, you always need to be thinking about the short-term and long-term effects of any particular new thing, new tactic, or new business approach that you roll out. Hard paywalls, I think, will make your website suffer in the long run because you will get less clicks, fewer positive engagement signals. And as another side effect, you tend to get fewer links pointing to you as well. If people can't read your article, they're less likely to cite it as a source when they write about that particular story themselves. So, paywall content tends to have lower engagement signals and lower link signals, and that in the long run, I think, has a detrimental impact on your website's ability to rank in top stories and in Google Discover. Plus, of course, load speed and old-fashioned usability. If your website has too many ads, too many overlays, too many interstitials, it really turns people off, and also can lead people to just click the back button rather than read and engage with the article. And that would also be a negative engagement signal. I mean, you're not gathering the right amount of click data as far as Google is concerned. And that could result in fewer of your articles being shown to users in top stories and in Google Discover.
If you're too strict about how many ad units you're willing to load on the page for fear of bouncing visitors, you might also have a tough time paying the bills. So do you have any rules of thumb for balancing news against ad units on the page?
I find it hard to have engaging conversations with that about my clients because those are very much business decisions. And I come at things from a pure SEO angle. And I always put that in context with my clients as well. From a pure SEO angle, the optimum number of ads is 0. And that's, of course, not a meaningful recommendation you can give to a client because a lot of them rely on ad impressions to pay the bills. So it's about finding the optimum medium solution. The best recommendations I tend to give is to make ads in such a way, implement them in such a way that they don't interfere too much with actually reading the content. I think a lot of publishers make the mistake of putting ad units as like breaks in a news article. And I think that's probably the worst place to put ads. I've read interesting research a few years ago that says that every interruption in an article is an opportunity for a reader to disengage from the article. And you see this as well. The more interruptions you have in the article, the higher the bounce rate, basically. The quicker people leave the article. They might just read the first few paragraphs, and the moment they hit an interruption, which could be an image, could be an embedded tweet, and could be an ad, a lot of them tend to bounce away and click the back button. And then the more of those you have, the more audience you lose as the article progresses. So I would recommend to my clients who are interested in optimizing for longer engagement with their content to try and minimize the interruptions in an article itself and maybe put ads above it, put it below it, to the side of it, but not in the flow of the article itself. So that once someone starts reading, they will be encouraged to read all the way through the end, and you're not giving them an opportunity to basically disengage from that article.
Our guest today is news search expert Barry Adams of Polemic Digital. And when we come back, we're going to talk about how AI is affecting news search. Stay with us. Barry, based on what we know so far about generative AI, let's talk first about what the impact will be on editorial decision-making. Which types of news stories do you think are most likely to be written by AI first, and why?
Yeah, this is always an interesting one. I see some newsrooms use AI already to generate articles, which tend to be very numbers and statistics based articles. For example, up and down movement of stock markets, or match reports from high school basketball games. That sort of stuff was already semi-automated to a large extent. And now with the new levels of generative AI we have, those articles just get better, and you can do them more confidently at a larger scale. And some publishers have started doing that. And as long as you declare that it's AI generated or AI co-written, perhaps, I think that's fine. I think there's an audience for that, and I think you're probably not going to be in any problems if you have that sort of content, unless of course it's just terrible content and you should be ashamed of it, in which case you probably shouldn't publish it in the first place. Outside of that, newsrooms that have adopted AI, I mean, in various different ways, it can be a really handy tool to semi-automate processes or help journalists when it comes to things like finding sources, do good internal linking to related articles and topic pages, find the right images, or even create image descriptions, for example. AI is very powerful to do that. I know a lot of journalists hate putting alt attributes on images when they upload them as part of an article, but with generative AI, you probably don't need to, because the AI can do it for you. Can just give you a fairly decent description of what the image itself contains. So I think AI-assisted journalism is probably going to be the new modus operandi for a lot of publishers, where there will be some sort of AI assistant baked into the content management system. And I think that's perfectly fine, as long as standard journalistic practices still apply. There's still some sort of fact-checking going on. I think that level of integration is okay. Pure news being generated entirely by AI. See, I'm worried about that a little bit. You see this with some search engines like Perplexity that allow you to summarize news stories, even ones that are behind a paywall. And I just think that's a very risky business model, because it removes a lot of the incentives for creating the news in the first place. And we might end up in a world where every serious news website is behind a very hard paywall to try and prevent the generative AI systems from using them as summaries. And theoretically, that shouldn't already be happening. I read an interesting article recently that you can use Perplexity to summarize an article published behind the paywall on the New York Times, but the New York Times actively blocks Perplexity's bot. However, Perplexity's bot doesn't seem to take particular note of that and still allows you to summarize the article. I think that's just theft. I think as a news industry, we can't let that happen. We need to make sure that the AI systems, if they use our content, we at least get some incentive for creating that content in the first place in some sort of licensing model or whatever it is. We can't just let people reuse and steal content without any form of remuneration there.
Nevertheless, they're all doing it, including Google. Why do you think Google is so bullish on introducing these new AI overviews into search engine results pages when they're not ready? I mean, could it be that in the age of ChatGPT and Perplexity and TikTok, traditional SERPs just aren't interesting enough anymore?
I don't think this is a user-led decision. I don't think this is something that Google understands that users want. In fact, I think a lot of users just don't really care too much about AI overviews and might not really engage with them. I think AI overviews are a public image exercise for Google. Google, in probably the last year or two, has been seen to be lagging behind the AI race. OpenAI has taken over the lead on a lot of AI stories as the big AI company, which Google can't really abide by, because large language models were invented by Google in the first place. So they should be at the forefront of it. But perceptually, they haven't been. And I think that's why they rolled out AI overview, so that they can say, hey, we are at the forefront of generative AI. We are taking the lead on this. This is our shiny new toy, and we're the experts on this. I genuinely don't think AI overviews, like you said, are ready. I don't think they are something that would get a huge amount of adoption. At the moment, I see them as sort of a featured snippet on steroids. Some users will like it, some users won't. Generally, I think it's a lot depending on how people trust it and whether or not they feel they get a reliable answer from an AI overview or not. But then people have always had that particular conundrum with normal web pages as well, if a web page and their content can be trusted or not. So it'll probably be on an even keel there with content published on the web. I think we may see user behavior slowly shift towards AI overviews, because it provides, I'm almost hesitant to say, a better user experience than going to a website nowadays. You go to a website, you have to click away the cookie notification, you have to click away the subscribe to our email newsletter notification, you have to contend with a lot of other bad usability factors like slow load speed and overwhelming advertising. Affiliate links, all those stuff. And you don't have any of that in an AI overview. So I think users of Google, might start to prefer AI overviews and might want to see more of them, in which case we will see more of them. I think Google will let users dictate how often AI overviews will appear and for what kind of queries they will appear, whether or not users really want them or not. And they might even allow people to generate one for a search result that at the moment does not yet have an AI overview. There might become a button available on the search result that says, create an AI overview for me for this. And I think that would be an interesting way for Google to also measure how many people want it, and where that sort of content would be more useful versus where it's not useful. Google has gone on record to say that they will avoid showing AI overviews for hard news topics because, of course, the generative models are constantly being retrained on new content, but they will lag behind the latest news by a couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of months, maybe. So for hard news, they will still have to rely on news publishers to generate that first draft of history, as journalists like to call it. But for any sort of other content, evergreen content, explainer, background stories, you name it, I think AI overviews might in the long term become a genuine threat, in which case we will have to really reevaluate what a free and open web looks like and what the incentives are for people to create content on the web.
And that's, of course, they're just gambling that people aren't going to create content anymore. It's just all going to be robots, regardless of the quality. I mean, you think of something like, you probably grew up in the age when people had stereos with big speakers, and it was all about fidelity and listening to analog, vinyl records. And we all willingly sacrificed that for random access and infinite selection. So we may wind up in a similar sort of economic and practical decision here with news publishers, but that's another discussion for another episode. Barry, let's face it, Google cannot reliably identify organic behavior. If they could, they wouldn't be gamed so frequently, and they wouldn't have to reweight their ranking factors all the time. And this begs the question, is the notion of organic search just PR? Because it seems like the choice of the word organic to describe the use of math to identify organic behavior is really just nothing more than spin.
That's a very good question, Eric. You put that really, really well. Yeah, I mean, I think we'll have to accept that Google is a curated ecosystem. It's not a meritocracy. It's not a best content always wins kind of ecosystem. I think maybe we had a lofty ideal in our heads about Google search and other search engines of being made the best person, made the best content win kind of contest. But I don't think that's ever been really true. And in the last probably 5 years, it's definitely not true. I think it is a curated system where Google decides who ranks, who doesn't rank, and they get it wrong very, very often. Every algorithm update has its winners and losers, and you can't honestly say that the losers always deserve to lose and the winners always deserve to win. And that, I think, is a very hard pill to swallow, because I see a lot of proper long-term established publications who are pretty much doing almost everything right in terms of what they should be focusing their content on. Could have good editorial expertise, usable websites that easily crawlable and indexable, and those websites can still lose. They can still lose huge chunks of their traffic from one day to the next because they fell foul of whatever specific metric Google has crafted a new algorithm update around, and that makes it very difficult for publishers to commit to building organic traffic over time because it's just unreliable. You might not be doing anything wrong. You might be ticking all the boxes as a publisher, and you still wouldn't be guaranteed to win. Which is why, go back to what I said earlier, your long-term bet should be to build a loyal audience, to build direct traffic, to bypass the gatekeepers of the world, be they Google, be they Apple, be they whoever it is that controls the dials and switches of user behavior. That's the only way to build a proper online brand nowadays. And you should always try and minimize your reliance on the gatekeepers like Google. But for the moment, they still play a very large role in how people discover content and how people engage with content on the web. So we have to play their games. And for one, I'm quite grateful for that, because my whole job is SEO. And if that disappears, I'm going to have to retrain and become something else. I might still find myself becoming a forest ranger or something like that. That might not be a bad backup career.
So for those of you who have been listening to me for many years, you just heard from Barry that the Homeland Embassy strategy is still relevant. Barry, final question. Why do you think we always assumed that Google was so much smarter than they actually are?
Yeah, I think that's the virtue of their black box algorithms, and the way Google talked about their search engine as well. I mean, we probably overestimated Google's intelligence on some levels and underestimated it on other levels. But yeah, I think we maybe always hoped that Google was smarter than they actually let on. I think a lot of people who were really nerdy about SEO, and I would call myself among that, would enjoy reading things like information retrieval science papers to sort of see what the state of the art in that particular industry is, and have maybe a higher expectation of what a large-scale web-based search engine like Google would be capable of doing. But at the same time, the more you know, the more you realize how noisy the web is, how unreliable some signals really are on the scale that the web, that Google operates at. And therefore, Google has to sort of fall back on some trusted metrics that it knows are very hard to game, or that at least it feels confident it can filter the noise out of. And those signals tend to be a lot more simplistic. Those signals are simply about, does someone click on this, yes or no? And how long does it take for that person to come back to the search result, or do they not come back at all? So very simplistic measures about how users interact with content and how that can be interpreted in different ways depending on different metrics that Google takes into account. So yeah, maybe that is the key lesson we can take away from this leak, as well as from recent Google algorithm updates. And also from AI overviews, that Google isn't maybe as smart as what we want it to be, that Google isn't maybe a benevolent overlord of the web that is omnipotent and just knows and sees everything, but that it is just another company that's struggling to build a product that its users want to use, and trying to make sure that they don't get overrun by the flow of technology themselves.
Barry Adams, SEO consultant at Polemic Digital. Thank you for joining us. For more on how you can earn influence through earned media, get the Digital Pivot audiobook at digitalpivotbook.com.